Insurance companies called it the nuclear option. General Motors rated it at 450 horsepower, the highest U.S. factory rating of 1970. But enthusiasts have long argued the LS6 made more than the brochure admitted, and the mid-13 second quarter mile times backed that up. When the real-world performance numbers surfaced, it changed everything we thought we knew about what GM was actually building in their factories. By 1969, the muscle car wars had reached fever pitch. Every manufacturer was pushing the envelope, but General Motors was playing it safe with their corporate 400 cubic inch limit for intermediate cars. The 1969 Chevelle SS came with respectable power, but Chevy, New Ford, and Chrysler were gaining ground with their big block monsters. Something had to change. The bean counters at GM were terrified of insurance companies and government regulators who were already circling the muscle car market like vultures. Every horsepower rating was scrutinized. Every performance claim could trigger rate increases or regulatory attention. But the engineers in Detroit had a different problem. They were getting embarrassed at the drag strips. Then came 1970, and everything changed. Buried in the Chevelle option list was a seemingly innocent code, RPO Z15. This wasn't just another engine option, it was GM's declaration of war. The 454 cubic inch Mark IV big block was finally going into the mid-size Chevelle, and it would be available in two versions: the mild-mannered LS5 at 360 horsepower and the absolute monster, the LS6. The LS6 wasn't just bigger than anything GM had put in an intermediate before. It was engineered like a race engine that happened to have a warranty. Solid lifter cam, 11.25:1 compression ratio, rectangular port heads that flowed like rivers, and that distinctive ZL2 cowl induction hood that force-fed cold air directly into the carburetor. When you ordered the SS454 package with RPO Z15 and specified the LS6 engine option, you weren't buying transportation, you were buying a barely legal race car. General Motors claimed 450 horsepower at 5,600 RPM. But many enthusiasts and builders argue the LS6's true output was higher than 450 horsepower, a belief reinforced by its mid-13s at around 106 to 108 miles per hour quarter-mile performance on factory tires. GM may have used conservative ratings to avoid insurance and regulatory heat common in 1970. The proof was in the performance. Period tests recorded 13.2 to 13.8 second quarter miles at around 106 to 108 miles per hour, straight from the factory. Car and Driver later listed the LS6 Chevelle at 5.4 seconds, 0 to 60, among the decade's quickest. Those numbers didn't lie, even if the horsepower ratings were conservative. Car and Driver got their hands on one in 1970 and couldn't believe what they were seeing. 0 to 60 in 5.4 seconds from a car that weighed over 3,600 pounds. The quarter-mile times were embarrassing supercars that cost 3 times as much. This wasn't just the most powerful production car ever built. It was proof that American manufacturers had figured out how to build legitimate supercars disguised as family haulers. But the numbers only told half the story. Actually driving an LS6 Chevelle was like trying to control a barely contained explosion. The torque curve started at idle and just kept climbing. 500 pound-feet at 3,600 RPM that would light up the rear tires at will and pull like a freight train all the way to redline. The ZL2 cowl induction system made the experience even more dramatic. Under part throttle, the hood stayed sealed and the car seemed almost civilized. But when you buried the accelerator, that forward-facing hood scoop would open like a hungry mouth, feeding the carburetor from the high-pressure zone at the base of the windshield, delivering cooler, denser air under throttle with an intake roar that sounded like controlled violence. The solid lifter cam meant you could hear this engine coming from 3 blocks away, that distinctive loping idle that announced to everyone within earshot that this wasn't your typical family car. When that big block fired up, it didn't just start. It announced its presence with mechanical authority that made the ground shake. But here's what the magazines couldn't capture: what it was actually like to live with 500 horsepower in 1970. The LS6 Chevelle wasn't just fast, it was antisocial. Gas stations became regular stops because the big block would drink premium fuel at an alarming 8 miles per gallon in city driving. The solid lifter cam meant valve adjustments every few thousand miles, and finding a mechanic who understood how to work on a race-bred engine wasn't always easy. The car demanded respect in ways that modern performance cars don't. No traction control, no stability management, no computer intervention of any kind. When you lit up those rear tires, and you would, whether you meant to or not, it was pure driver skill that kept you pointed in the right direction. The LS6 Chevelle should have dominated the market, but General Motors made a critical miscalculation. The very power that made it legendary also made it nearly impossible to sell. Insurance companies started charging premiums that doubled or tripled the cost of ownership. Young buyers who could afford the car payments couldn't afford the insurance. Only 4,475 were built, largely because insurance premiums and shifting regulations throttled demand. Not because Chevy couldn't build more. The insurance industry had effectively killed the market for cars this powerful. The dealership experience told the whole story. Walk into a Chevrolet showroom in 1970, and the Chevelle SS looked almost ordinary sitting next to the flashier Corvette. But savvy buyers knew to look for that innocuous RPO Z15 on the option sheet. For just $263 over the base SS price, you could transform a civilized family hauler into the most powerful production car in America. Ford and Chrysler watched nervously as GM's experiment crashed and burned in the marketplace. The lesson was clear: there was such a thing as too much power, at least when you admitted to it publicly. The era of honest horsepower ratings was ending before it really began. What made the LS6 so special wasn't just the horsepower. It was how that power was delivered. The Mark IV 454 big block was a completely different animal from previous Chevy engines. Bigger bore spacing, stronger block casting, heads that could flow enough air to feed a small aircraft engine. High-flow rectangular port heads, a performance design that could exceed around 300 cubic feet per minute in period big block applications, helped the LS6 breathe at high RPM. Combined with that solid lifter cam and 11.25 to 1 compression, the engine could breathe like nothing else in the GM lineup. The ZL2 cowl induction system was pure genius, disguised as a styling gimmick. By drawing air from the high-pressure zone at the base of the windshield instead of the low-pressure area above the grille, the system delivered cooler, denser air that enhanced performance at highway speeds. More air meant more power, and more power meant domination. For the Chevelle, the LS6 was effectively a one-year phenomenon in 1970. Chevrolet announced it for 1971, but dropped the option early, and no verified 71 Chevelle LS6s are documented. But its impact on automotive history was immeasurable. This was the peak of American muscle car development, the moment when Detroit proved it could build world-class performance cars that happened to have backseats. Today, documented LS6 Chevelles regularly exceed $150,000 at major auctions, with standout cars going much higher. The combination of rarity, documented performance, and historical significance has made them among the most valuable muscle cars ever produced. The irony is that modern cars now routinely exceed the LS6's power output, but they do it with computers, sophisticated engine management, and emission controls that would have seemed like science fiction in 1970. The LS6 achieved its legendary status through pure mechanical aggression, compression, cam timing, and airflow that was optimized for one thing: making power. General Motors learned the lesson of the LS6 well. When they returned to high-performance cars decades later, they were much more careful about how they marketed the power. But the engineering principles that made the LS6 legendary — strong bottom end, efficient heads, aggressive cam timing — those became the foundation for every performance engine GM has built since. The 1970 Chevelle SS 454 LS6 represented the absolute peak of the original muscle car era, the moment when American manufacturers proved they could build cars that rivaled anything in the world for pure acceleration. It was too powerful for its own good, too honest about its capabilities, and too perfect to survive in the changing automotive landscape of the early 1970s. But for one brief, shining moment, General Motors built the most powerful production car in automotive history and tried to pretend it was just another engine option. The insurance companies weren't fooled, the government regulators weren't fooled, and the competition definitely wasn't fooled. Only 4,475 people got to experience what 500-plus horsepower felt like in 1970, disguised as a family car with the innocuous RPO Z15 option. What other underrated muscle cars were actually making more power than the manufacturers admitted? Share your thoughts in the comments below and subscribe for more stories about the cars that pushed the boundaries of what was possible when horsepower was king and every stoplight was a potential drag strip.